Welcome to the Chosen Few, where today we will be exploring the Battle of Sedan. If you wish to join in and see if you survive the encounter, please pick a number between 1 and 40 and leave it in the comments below, and we will reveal the casualty rates at the end of the episode. Good luck. May 1940. The Lorraine Platoon, men of the 3rd Company, 331st Infantry Regiment, waited by the Meuse River near Sedan. For them, the war felt distant. Their sector was deemed a quiet one, a strategic backwater. French doctrine declared the dense Ardennes Forest to their east impassable for a major armoured thrust, a geographical shield reinforced by dogma. They were positioned as a mere formality, the men feeling more like forgotten watchmen, their presence symbolic rather than strategic. These were reserve troops of the 55th Infantry Division, older men, fathers, and factory workers, called up to hold the hinge of the French defense. They had minimal heavy support, relying entirely on the river, and the belief that the main German blow would fall far to the north in Belgium. Their training was rigid, focused entirely on the slow, defensive attrition of the Great War's methodical battle. Their uniforms were ill-fitting, their morale reflecting the low priority given to their vital post. The Lorraine Platoon was large, nearly 40 men strong, designed to lay down a wall of sustained fire using the Châtellerault FM 24-29 LMGs. This LMG-centric doctrine was rigid. They were static fire support, not maneuver troops. They were designed only to hold ground. Their defensive works were often incomplete, lacking proper rear security or even essential communication trenches, reinforcing their feeling of isolation and vulnerability. Their platoon leader strained to interpret garbled radio reports of fighting far to the north, unaware of the actual danger. Meanwhile, the German mechanized divisions, led by General Heinz Guderian, committed to the impossible. They ignored the limitations of the forest roads. Tanks, armored cars, and motorized infantry burst through the Ardennes like a flash flood. Their pace was maniacal, their doctrine based on speed. The German command wagered everything on audacity, betting that sheer velocity would paralyze the French high command before the 331st Regiment even saw them. For 2 days, the German forces drove non-stop, pushing men and machines to the breaking point. They were moving too fast for French intelligence to locate them accurately, too fast for French high command to react. The key strategic error was not committing air reserves to bomb the congested columns. The Air Force, which could have bombed the congested roads to ruin, was held back for the main event in Belgium. This fatal oversight condemned the men at Sedan. The French command allowed the enemy to move unopposed through the greatest natural choke point on the Western Front. Then, on the evening of May 12th, the silence broke. The platoon leader of the Lorraine Platoon shouted the alarm as the first German vehicles burst from the trees across the Meuse. They had arrived 5 days ahead of schedule. The French sappers blew the major bridges, but it was a futile gesture against the massed forces now staring them down. The Lorraine Platoon quickly manned their few machine gun nests. Their platoon leader knew immediately this was no raid. It was an entire armored corps. Their orders were clear: hold the bank at all costs. But the sight of hundreds of tanks and thousands of men assembling across the water was a shattering psychological blow. The Germans arrayed themselves under the cover of the wooded hills, preparing the final steps of their assault. The reserve men faced a terrifying truth. They were the only things standing between the German spearhead and the open French rear. The French shield was thin, and the sword was already at its throat. The battle for the breakthrough was set to begin at dawn, and the Lorraine Platoon was directly in its path. May 13th. The German forces skipped the artillery duel and used the Luftwaffe as their primary weapon. For 8 straight hours, the Lorraine Platoon's sector was hammered by waves of bombers. Over 1,000 German sorties turned the Sedan sector into a localized hell. The platoon had no anti-aircraft guns. The skies belonged entirely to the attacker. The bombardment was not only about destruction, but about breaking the will to fight, preparing the ground for the engineers to cross. The star of this terror was the Stuka dive bomber. They heard its siren, the Jericho Trumpet, before they saw the plane. This sound was a sustained, shrieking form of torture that exceeded the training and endurance of the older reservists. They were pinned down, unable to fire back. The terrifying noise, combined with the explosions, psychologically paralyzed the defense. The German goal was not to destroy the bunkers, but to destroy the courage inside them, creating an instantaneous strategic defeat. Inside their bunkers, communication was instantly lost. Phone lines snapped, radios went silent. The platoon leader was isolated, unable to request support or inform his superiors of the true devastation. The men were left alone to make life or death decisions. The reservists, lacking the hardened nerve of regulars, began to break down under the relentless, overwhelming terror. The cracks in the concrete seemed to reflect the sudden, catastrophic failure of their resolve. Then came the flight. Not just the Lorraine Platoon's men, but entire sections and companies of the 55th Division abandoned their positions and fled westward. The platoon leader tried to hold his men steady, but the sight of their comrades streaming past, throwing down weapons and equipment, made the panic contagious. The defense of Sedan was dissolving into nothing but running men, a self-inflicted strategic wound. As the air attack subsided, German combat engineers hit the water. They found wide, empty gaps where units of the 331st Regiment should have been. The platoon opened fire with their LMGs, but the fire was disorganized. The enemy engineers, highly trained, used smoke and concentrated small arms fire to cross the water and secure small, desperate bridgeheads. Their discipline and training shone in the chaos of the crossing. The bridgeheads held. German infantry, highly mobile and armed with the devastating MG-34, scrambled onto the bank, pushing inland ruthlessly. The fight was brutal, close quarters, and focused entirely on momentum. The Lorraine Platoon's rigid, LMG-centric structure was no match for the German small units' aggression and superior firepower. They were quickly pushed back, overwhelmed, or surrounded by the rapid advance. The engineers worked feverishly, and within hours, pontoons were laid. The first German Panzer tank rolled across the Meuse onto French soil, driving into the heart of the strategic gap. The Lorraine Platoon's brief, brutal fight was over. The psychological shield was broken, the floodgates were open, and the armored torrent was about to sweep away the entire French campaign. The speed of the crossing, achieved in less than a day, was the operational triumph that won the battle. Once across the river, the Panzers did not linger. They vanished, driving hard and deep to the west. Guderian's strategy was total commitment to speed. The Lorraine Platoon, now shattered, attempted to regroup, but the enemy was gone, creating a void behind them. The German forces ignored their flanks, knowing their velocity would paralyze the French command and make counterattacks impossible to organize. The platoon was left as an isolated pocket of disorganized men in what was rapidly becoming occupied territory. Far to the south, the French launched their one chance at desperate counterattack near Stuka. Their few elite armored divisions fought a brutal, 4-day duel with the Panzers. They were fighting the right battle, but too late and too far from the main breakthrough. The magnificent French B-1 bis heavy tanks fought with grim determination. Their armor was technologically superior, shrugging off most German anti-tank fire. But superior armor was not enough. The Germans brought their powerful 88mm flak guns down to the front line, a weapon that could punch through the B-1 bis's thick plating. The French tactical doctrine failed again. Their tanks were isolated and unsupported, eventually smashed by concentrated, high-velocity firepower. Stuka changed hands 17 times, but the German wedge held. The last hope of closing the massive gap was gone. With the gap wide open, the Panzers drove towards the coast. The Lorraine Platoon and other scattered units began to retreat, only to encounter German patrols deep inside French territory. The High Command was still convinced the armored columns were minor raids, failing to grasp the total collapse of their defensive structure. This critical failure of intelligence made the retreat disorganized, blind, and fatal for thousands of soldiers. The Lorraine Platoon's movement became a nightmare, merging with streams of civilian refugees, carts, women, and children all heading west. Their platoon leader struggled to keep the men together, but military discipline was melting into human panic. The platoon was no longer a unit with a purpose. They were simply survivors trying to find a French line that no longer existed. The sheer scale of the chaos was the Germans' most powerful strategic tool. Every mile the German tanks gained was a nail in the coffin of the Allied armies to the north. The British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army Group, fighting the correct battle in Belgium, were utterly oblivious to the catastrophe rushing up behind them. The strategic encirclement, set in motion by the German speed at Sedan, was tightening into an unbreakable noose. The failure of a single reserve division had doomed nearly 1 million men. On May 20th, 1940, the German tanks reached the English Channel coast at Abbeville. The breakthrough was complete. The Lorraine Platoon's brief, brutal fight at the Meuse had decided the fate of the entire campaign. Nearly 1 million Allied soldiers were now encircled. The men of the platoon, if they survived the chaos, were left isolated, scattered, or marching into German captivity. Their courage was not enough to overcome the audacity of the blitzkrieg. The smoke over the Meuse had not yet cleared when the Lorraine Platoon ceased to exist as a military unit. In the clinical language of high command, they were simply accounted for in the loss of a division. But for the 40 men of the 3rd Company, the statistics of the Sedan disaster were written in flesh, blood, and years of silence. Their story is a microcosm of the fall of France, a unit not entirely destroyed by fire, but shattered by the sheer velocity of a new kind of war. Physical death took the smallest toll. 3 men of the platoon remained forever on the riverbank, killed in the first terrifying minutes of the Stuka bombardment. 5 more were left behind in the dark concrete of the pillboxes, wounded by shrapnel or the searing heat of German flamethrowers. For these 8, the battle was a brief, violent flash. The vast majority, 24 men, met a different fate. These were the victims of the panic of Sedan. Caught in the void created by the Panzer advance, they found themselves walking through a landscape where the front line had simply evaporated. On May 14th, in the open fields near Bulsen, they were overtaken by German motorized columns. There was no grand final stand. There was only the cold click of Lugers being cocked and the command to raise their hands. For these 24, the war did not end in 1940. It began a 5-year odyssey of industrial labor and starvation in the stalags of the East. They would spend the next half-decade behind barbed wire, watching from afar as their country was occupied and eventually liberated. They were the lost soldiers, men whose youth was traded for a strategic error they didn't commit. Their capture was the true victory of the blitzkrieg, the total removal of an army without the need to kill it. Only 8 men of the Lorraine Platoon escaped the net. Some were local reservists who used their knowledge of the Ardennes to slip through the woods, evading German patrols by day and moving by starlight. Others managed to find the retreating French lines, only to be folded into other broken units for the final, hopeless defense of June. They were the survivors, left to carry the heavy weight of what they had seen at the Meuse, the day the world's finest army was unmade in 72 hours. So please join us for a moment in remembrance for the unfortunate and brave men of the French army. Thank you for joining us for another episode, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.